Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the Financial Security webinar. Our speaker today is Barbara O'Neill, and she's going to be talking about her new book that's just recently come out, Flipping a Switch, 25 action steps for happiness and financial security in later life. And she talks about how some of those changes are like flipping a switch, and it may be just a light switch that flips on and off, or it might be the dimmer switch. One of the things she talks about is for many of us, we have worked our entire adult lives, sometimes even starting when we were teenagers. Barbara O'Neill is a Ph.D., CFP, AFC, CRPC, and CEO of Money Talk, financial planning seminars, and publications, as well as the author of the new book, Flipping a Switch, 25 Action Steps for Happiness and Financial Security in Later Life.
Yeah, I'm really pleased to be talking about my new passion project, which is the book, Flipping a Switch. And I actually began this book 4 months before I left Rutgers on January 1st, 2020. And I completed it actually yesterday with the completion of the foreword, which was written by Don Blandon, who many of you know. The book is still in process. It's not out there yet, but you can order it on Amazon if you would like to do that at some point. So let's begin, and let's just talk about the word flipping a switch. We've just heard that phrase so often. Everybody seems to be using it now to talk about when do we get back to normal, or at least a new normal, after the ordeal that we've been going through with the COVID-19. And so they've been using the phrase flipping a switch to refer to restarting the economy, getting things back to normal, opening up schools, and just a whole number of things. And what we really talk about with flipping a switch is usually kind of a sudden type of change where you're kind of on one day and off the other. And so the book is about that, and it's about all different types of switches, as you'll hear. I'm going to go through 25 of them, and there's actually 35 in the book. And when you hear the phrase flip switch, just think about transition, because that's really what we're talking about, is all the transitions that are out there. And it's very interesting. If any of you get the Wall Street Journal, there was an article just yesterday called Quarantine Offers a Preview of Retirement. And I actually blogged about this about 4 weeks ago, and I realized it myself, that the country right now is going through many of the same changes that people go through when they leave a long-term career. People are adjusting to a change in income. For many people, most people in this country, it's been a big decrease in income, but there are some people who are actually making more money as a result of coronavirus. So we've got changes in income. We have people filling out their days trying to say, okay, how do I keep busy? What do I do? And that's a new experience for a lot of people. Too much togetherness. And that's been written up quite a bit, and there's actually, unfortunately, been increases in domestic abuse and some negatives as well associated with that. People are trying to create a paycheck, which is what many retirees try to do. And also people becoming fraud bait with all the new COVID-19 scams, and people who are older often become victims of fraud as well. So let me tell you how I got started with this project. First of all, as many of you know, I worked for Rutgers Cooperative Extension, and I was there for 41 years, 4 months to be exact. But now Rutgers is in my rearview window. And so is the state of New Jersey, because I moved to Florida. So my first inspiration for writing the book is I was looking for direction. And I couldn't find the book that I needed to have written, so I wrote it myself, basically, because I wanted to have more than personal finance. I wanted to look at all the life changers. And there were financial books that were out there, and there were baby boomers trying to find themselves types of books that were out there, but there was nothing that kind of put it together. So that was my first inspiration, is just the fact that I was going to be living this material myself. The second inspiration is I went down to the American Savings Education Council meeting in the summer of 2018, and there was a presentation there about spending in retirement. And Lori Lucas, who's the CEO of EBRI, the organization that sponsored the conference, she was doing this research presentation, and most of it was about things that we're quite familiar with, the fact that people are unprepared for retirement, don't have a lot of savings, and it's going to be a real struggle for them. But then she said there's a subset of retirees who have a unique problem. And notice that's in quotes, because a lot of people wouldn't think that this is a problem to have a lot of money saved up. But the problem is that people have been saving all this money, and then they're not comfortable spending it, and their assets keep growing. And if any of you got the AFCPE newsletter yesterday, Andy Wren from Ziders wrote an article, and I encourage you to read it, because she talked about the same exact thing, how to help clients flip the switch from saving to spending. So what Lori talked about was that there's this subset of people who have been saving their entire life, they're not comfortable with spending, and their assets are just going to keep on growing. And so what she said at the end of her presentation is that we need financial education to teach people how to flip a switch from saving to spending. So that kind of planted the seed right there for me. The second motivation, in addition to knowing I was going to be leaving Rutgers pretty soon. And then the third thing happened, and it was like a perfect storm of things that happened at the very same time. On the train down to the meeting that I just told you about, I was reading an article in the American Association of Individual Investors Journal, AAII, that was called Grasshoppers and Ants in Retirement. And they talked about the same exact thing that I just heard about at the ASEC meeting, that you've got these thrifty ants, if you remember the fable between the ants are the ones that are prepared and the grasshoppers are the ones that are out there, partying and couldn't care less about their future. So the article was talking about these ants who are spending less in retirement than they are financially able to. And it asked the question, why did people save all this money if they're not going to spend it down? Which is exactly what Andy Wren was talking about in her AFCPE article, same exact thing. Why did you save all this money? And one of the things they talked about in this research article is something called the habit formation hypothesis. So what that means is people get used to living at a certain level. So if you've been frugal your entire adult life, like 40 years, it's very hard to reverse that and all of a sudden break out of your normal spending habits, whether it's generic foods or, coach on an airplane or whatever. It's just foreign to you to be spending in a way that you're not used to. So all of those things kind of came together in my mind as the inspiration for the book. And then I realized that there's all sorts of switches, because I had begun to start thinking about them for my own life and realized that there's a lot of changes that I'm going to have to make, not just spending down my savings, but just a whole bunch of things related not just to money either, but how am I going to spend my time? What am I going to do? What am I going to call myself? And so then I realized that there were all these different light switches, and that became the genesis for the book, is identifying all of these light switches. And then I talked with a colleague, Paul Westbrook, who actually died about a year ago, one of my colleagues at Rutgers. And he and I got out to lunch one day and we were talking, and he came up with the insight about dimmer switches. And I hadn't really thought about that. But, some of these changes aren't necessarily on and off. They could be more like gradual transitions, like a dimmer switch. So some of the areas that kind of fall into that would be maybe a change gradually in your work habits and how many hours you work. Your spending can change gradually, your investment asset allocation, downsizing. Usually people just don't check out a whole bunch of stuff at once. It gets gradually downsized over time. And then maybe your engagement with different activities and kind of stepping away from others can take place gradually, and also simplification. So we're hearing a lot about dimmer switches now with COVID-19 too. I mean, everybody out there, Dr. Fauci particularly, and a number of people are all talking about this gradual restart of the economy. Nobody's going to flip a switch one day and go back exactly to where we were, let's say in, early January. It's going to be very gradual depending on the location where people live and their population density and that sort of thing. So as I conceived the book, I realized that I could kind of categorize the different transitions into three different main sections of the book. So the first section deals with financial transitions, and there's 15 chapters there. And then there's 5 chapters in social transitions and 15 chapters in lifestyle transitions. So that comprises the 35 chapters. There's also an introduction chapter and a final thoughts chapter. And then, as I mentioned before, the foreword was written by Don Blandon from the Investor Protection Trust. So one other thing I want to mention before I get into the actual flip switches is that I want to acknowledge that the book was written, not all of it, but some of the chapters were written from what I call a place of privilege. Because again, not every older adult is going to have the options that are in this book. And I think it's really important to realize, to recognize that and to acknowledge it. 1/3 of American workers have saved nothing for retirement. And then if you look at the savings that has been done, 40% of people have less than $25,000 saved. And that includes 19% who have less than $1,000 saved. So there's a whole lot of people out there that are not going to be making any, big spending changes or anything like that. So we just need to acknowledge that and just think of this maybe as a little bit of a niche book because it was written for the people who do have more choices and options in later life. And so what I'm going to do now is talk about 25 of them. I don't think I had time for 35, so I figured let me get it down to 25. You'll have to read the book to get the other 10 that I don't cover. So the first one is, the chapter is called, If You Don't Spend Your Money, Someone Else Will. And I have to give credit to that title to Kathy Bowen from Penn State Extension. And she and a colleague did a presentation at NEFCS in September, I guess it was, back in Hershey, and did an entire workshop, in-depth workshop. And Kathy kept using this phrase, and I thought, well, that's a great phrase. I'm going to make it one of the chapters of my book. So what we're really talking about here is stepping outside your comfort zone. Again, going back to that lifestyle hypothesis there, if you've always been a very frugal person, maybe splurging once in a while. Maybe it's orchestra tickets at a play. Maybe it's business class on a plane or something like that. Maybe a higher level of travel, staying in a hotel. Just getting experience stepping outside your comfort zone. That can be important. I'm going to talk a little bit later in depth about automating savings withdrawals, but the thought there is that if taking money out of your savings causes you pain, and we have a lot of research that shows that people experience the pain of loss a whole lot more than the pleasure from gains. And even though you're taking out your own money, and it's not like a stock market loss, like we've been seeing a lot of lately, it's really just you taking out your own money. It still feels like a loss to people because you're seeing your balances go down. So if that's going to cause you a lot of problems psychologically, you may want to automate savings withdrawals. And we'll get into that a little bit more on another slide down the road. And then asking yourself some hard questions. Why did you amass all the savings if you aren't going to spend it? And if you don't spend your money, who will? somebody else will, as Kathy Bowen said. And really, there's only three places that your money can go. It's either going to go to heirs, and if you have a will, you'll name your heirs, and if you don't have a will, your state of residence will tell where that money is going to go. It could go to charities if you name charities, but state formulas do not include charities, so they only include family members. And then the other way it could go just through improper planning would be more money spent on taxes and going to the government. So your money will go somewhere. And then the big question is, what are you waiting for? I have a friend who always uses the saying, if not now, when? And it's really true when you think about it. Your health is probably not going to get any better as you get older, maybe stay the same, hopefully for a long period of time. But again, you don't want to run the risk. And this was what Andy talked about in her article in AFCPE. She talked about clients that were having a hard time spending, and then they were both killed in a car accident in their mid-60s, and they never did anything that was on their list. And how sad about that. So just deciding, what am I waiting for? Okay, chapter 2 is deciding when do you have enough, whatever enough happens to be. Some people have a dollar figure for enough. It might be $1 million. Some people might think of it more as a comfort factor. So what we're really talking about there is doing some savings calculations. And probably the best tool out there now, because they've taken the ballpark estimate down the last 4 months or so, because I had it in the book and then I had to go back with the revisions and replace it. And so I'm using the FINRA retirement calculator, which is pretty good. But whatever tool that you're looking at, you want to make sure that you check the underlying assumptions. What are they assuming for a rate of inflation? What are you putting in as the rate of return on investments that you have? You have to kind of look at all the assumptions and then try different scenarios. Some people hire financial advisors to help them with this decision of, do I have enough? Another tool that's out there that financial advisors often use, but you can also use yourself, there are tools online, is what they call a Monte Carlo calculator. And what that will do is tell you your probability of having enough money to last your lifetime. And they typically will you do a calculation for a 30-year period of time. So you want to make sure that you have a pretty high probability that you're not going to run out of money. Okay, number 3 is creating a paycheck. And of course, paycheck is in quotes because you're not going to have a real paycheck anymore once you step away from full-time work. But you've got to create the similarity of having a regular income, because your bills are still going to come in on a regular basis, and you need to have income do that as well. So some ways that people can do that, some action steps. Some people will set up what they call automatic withdrawal plans through their mutual funds. Just like when you were working, they have the ability to automate your deposits. So you put like maybe $100 a month into a mutual fund. Most funds also have an automatic withdrawal option. So then what you do there is you're able to take money out, like maybe $500 a month you take out. And you'll do that, of course, for as long as the money lasts. Once you take out all your money, it's gone. You can't do that anymore. Some people will set up what they call a ladder with either bonds or CDs. So for 6 months in a row, you'll buy bonds, because they usually pay semi-annual interest. So then once you set that up 6 months in a row, every 6 months, every month you'll be getting interest off of one of those bonds in that 6-month series. Or people will set up a CD ladder, and they might have a 3-month CD and a 6-month CD in a year and so forth. And again, the point is you're giving yourself the opportunity to earn income at regular intervals. Some people will purchase an annuity. And an annuity is a contract with a life insurance company that pays you a regular income, typically for one person's life, or sometimes for the life of a couple, the joint life expectancy of a couple. And that will pay you as long as you live. So that's a big difference. The automatic withdrawal plans pay out for as long as the money lasts. The annuity will pay out for as long as you last. And then the other thing to think about is that 4% rule that we've heard about so much. That may need to be amended. There is some recent research that suggests that maybe a safer withdrawal rate might be in the neighborhood of 2.5% to 3%, because fixed income securities have had such low rates of return, and we're seeing that now again with all the response to COVID-19. So you may want to have a lower percentage. Also, people who are leaving the workforce early, you think about these people that are in the FIRE community, financial independence, retire early, and they all want to retire at 45. Well, they're going to have more than a 30-year scenario there, so they might have to take out less. And then on the other hand, if people work longer and they're still working maybe into their mid-70s, maybe they can take out a higher percentage when they do leave the workforce, because their life expectancy at their late 70s is going to be a whole lot different than it would be in their mid-60s. So they probably won't have a 30-year horizon. So again, just something to think about. And again, people have to look at this on an individual basis. And then there's the chapter on RMDs, which I had to revise not once, but twice, because they've changed the rules in less than 4 months. They have changed the rules on required minimum distributions with the Secure Act that was passed in late December, and then the CARES Act that was just passed a couple of weeks ago with regard to COVID-19. So first they increased the RMD age to 72, and then with the CARES Act, they suspended RMDs for 2020 because, the markets are just so crazy, and they didn't want to have to force people to lock in losses when we have so much volatility in the financial markets. So the important thing with RMDs is you got to learn the law. I just wrote a blog post this week about RMDs. It'll go up tomorrow, so it kind of summarizes what the RMD regulations are about. And then from there, you need to develop an RMD spending plan, because there's only 3 things that you can do with that money that's required to come out. You can either resave it somewhere else, you can gift it to a charitable organization or to family members, whoever you want to gift it to, or you can spend it. You basically only have 3 options. So developing a plan for that money is important. Qualified charitable distributions, you can do those with money in a traditional IRA. And they didn't change the rule when they increased the age for RMDs from 70.5 to 72. They did leave the age for qualified charitable distributions at 70.5. So that would cover anybody that wants to do that. And then getting help when needed. RMDs are, you got to get it right, because it's the highest tax penalty in tax law. If you don't do your RMDs correctly, the penalty is 50% of the amount that you should have taken out, but you didn't. So if you need help, then obviously reach out to a CPA, a CFP, somebody who can help you navigate that new law that you need to comply with once you reach age 72. And then there's later life investing. So one thing I would just recommend people do for themselves and pass on to others is just a risk tolerance assessment. And there's probably no better time to assess a person's risk than at a time like right now, when the markets have been up and down like crazy. Because that's where we will definitely show our true risk tolerance. And the instrument that I'm talking about was the one that was developed by John Grable and Ruth Litton in 1999, published a research article. We put it on the Rutgers Cooperative Extension website, I believe in 2002. Almost 250,000 people took the assessment before we moved it over to the University of Missouri about a year and a half ago. So it's still collecting data for research, and it's still a great place for showing people where they can go to get an honest assessment of their risk tolerance. because that's going to inform what you do in later life. Well, at any time in life when you're investing, you want to go with your risk tolerance and your gut. If you have investments that are going to keep you up all night, it's probably not a good place to be putting your money. And then you will want to rebalance regularly. Rebalance means getting back to the original weights of assets in your portfolio that you desire. So let's say 50% stock, 30% bonds, 20% cash. Things can get out of kilter, when markets change. And some people will rebalance when things get off kilter by about 5 or 10%. Other people will have it locked in automatically. For example, I have TIAA, and I have it set up to rebalance once a year on my birthday. So that's where the rebalancing takes place. But you can set it up whatever way you want. And then I'll talk more about fraud later, but just introduce now the concept of just being aware. When people get older, they get targeted a lot. I don't know how it is, but I thought I was free of all the junk mail when I left New Jersey, because I wasn't going to sign up for anything. Nobody was going to find me. Wrong. They find you. They find you, and I can't tell you how many free meal seminars I've gotten invitations for since I moved to Ocala, Florida. And so the funniest thing is, right before the shutdown, because we've been like on total lockdown now for about 6 weeks here, I actually went to a few of these free meal seminars because I had been intrigued by it reading the book Pound Foolish, but I could never go to one of those where I lived because too many people knew me. I had a column in the newspaper with my picture on it and everything. I just knew too many people, and all those invitations, in the fine print, they always say, do not come if you're a financial advisor or anything. So I never felt comfortable going to any of those in Jersey because I just thought I would be outed. Somebody would come up and recognize me. But nobody knows me here down in Florida, so it's been great. So I actually went to a couple of these free meal seminars just to see what was going on. And I saw all the red flags. I mean, I saw speakers who had no credentials. I saw speakers who didn't identify who they were speaking for. I saw scare tactics, door prizes to get everybody's contact information. So of course I listed my old landline back in Jersey that was disconnected 6 months ago. Good luck trying to find me. But the point is, there are a whole lot of red flags, and there is research that's been done that connects the attendance at free meal seminars with an increased probability of being a target for fraud. So people need to be really careful about that in later life. Okay, chapter on adjusting to changes in income and expenses, and that can go either way, just like people with COVID-19. A lot of people are having lower incomes, but there are some people who will maybe have a higher income in later life, maybe because their pension kicks in, they've got savings, they're doing some work. There could be a number of combinations where sometimes people actually end up with more money, especially when their R&D start coming out. You've got that money coming out as well that's taxable. What I did in this chapter, though, was to really concentrate on income going the other direction. So people are living on less, because the first chapter really talks about the scenario where you've got more money than you know what to do with. So some of the options there are working longer, spending less, possibly doing some what they call geographic arbitrage. So that's kind of what I did. I left a high-cost state, New Jersey, and went to a much lower-cost state, Florida. Not only did I lose $10,000 of state income tax that I no longer have to pay, but my auto insurance premiums went down, homeowners insurance premiums went down, even my AAA membership, the same old AAA membership, it was $60 cheaper in Florida than it was in where I was back in Jersey. So sometimes just by moving can save a whole lot of money. But I also have in chapters that come later having to really think through that whole scenario from other considerations. It's not just a financial decision. It involves relationships and social support systems, and there's a lot more involved with it than just saving some money. Other ways that people can adjust to a lower income would be tapping out their home equity through reverse mortgages or selling and leasing back their house. Next chapter has to talk about tax withholding. It's what you get to keep. And again, people will have different sources of income that they didn't have when they were working, and they'll have to just check into the withholding on that income. So whether it's a pension, whether it's annuities, whatever they're tapping, best if you can have the tax coming out, but you'll also want to make sure that they take it out correctly, because when I got my first civil service retirement system pension check, I looked at the amount that they were taking out of tax, and I knew it wasn't going to be enough. So I had to go back into opm.gov and request higher tax withholding so that it will be, commensurate with what I think my income will be. You'll have to figure out your new marginal tax rates. For some people, it may go up. Others, it may go down. So you'll need to see if leaving your job changes your marginal tax rate. And then anything that's elective as a cash withdrawal, you might want to time that. That would be things like capital gains. Or maybe if you are charitably inclined and you want to set up what they call a donor advised fund, you might want to do that in a year that you have a higher income than normal, so that you'll get the best tax benefit from doing that. And again, you might want to consider hiring a professional to help you with new income tax decisions. Okay, I think I missed one here. Becoming a Social Security beneficiary. So sometime in your 60s, you're going to claim Social Security. The earliest you can claim is 62. The latest that you will want to claim would be before you turn 70, because once you hit age 70, there's no more delayed retirement credit, so it doesn't make sense to delay any longer. So you're going to need to be paying tax on that money, perhaps. The limits are pretty low is what you have to pay tax on, and they've never been indexed in over 25 years. So more and more people, as we go through inflation and incomes get higher just through inflation alone, are paying taxes on their Social Security. So you're going to need to make sure that you're paying in estimated taxes, and that would be quarterly. So typically, in a typical year, which 2020 is not because of COVID-19, you would be paying estimated taxes on April 15th. And this year, that's been pushed back till July. You would make your second quarter payment on June 15th. That's also been pushed back this year till July. And then your third quarter would be in September, and then your fourth quarter would be by January 15th of the following tax year. Also need to be aware of the earnings limit when you choose what age to collect Social Security. This year, it's $18,240 is the amount that you can earn if you're under your full retirement age. If you go over that amount, they're going to take back $1 for every $2 over the earnings limit. And then also taking care of your spouse. One of the things I did with the book is I got into a lot of research, and there was a study by the Center for Retirement Research that I thought was interesting. They found that husbands do not consider the drop in income that their wives would experience when they choose the age to collect Social Security. And it was actually experimental research, and they had different scenarios, and it didn't really make a difference. The husbands, it just didn't register with them that, if I worked a little bit longer or delayed my Social Security, my wife, who could be my widow, would have more money. It didn't seem to make a difference. So that was kind of an interesting piece of research that I found. Okay, number 9, healthcare transitions. So one thing to think about is when you leave a full-time job, you've got 2,500 extra hours to yourself. And the way I calculated that is you got 50 weeks times 50 hours. I gave you 2 weeks off of vacation. So that's 2,500 extra hours. So that gives people the ability to really take care of yourself. You have time to walk 10,000 steps a day, which takes me about an hour. I do 5,000 in the morning, 5,000 in the afternoon. It takes about an hour and half an hour apiece to do that. But you have 2,500 extra hours, so that gives you time to do that. You might also want to consider earmarking a portion of your nest egg for healthcare. The numbers are pretty sobering. Fidelity Investments estimated in 2019 that a couple age 65 would spend $285,000 for the remainder of their lifetime on out-of-pocket healthcare expenses. So these are all the things that aren't covered by insurance, you know, deductibles and copays and that kind of thing. You'll want to learn about Medicare and the supplements to Medicare. And probably a good place to go is that Medicare and You book. And also, as I found when I left Rutgers, another key resource will be the HR people at your company, because they'll be able to help you if you have retiree health insurance through your employer. They'll be able to help you make that seamless transition between being covered as an active employee and then covered afterwards. And if you don't have retiree health insurance, then of course it becomes really important to learn about the Medigap plans that are available. And then here's another one. This was an insight that my brother provided to me, because I got a whole lot of people kind of giving me information that informed the book. And one of the things I hadn't realized, but my brother experienced because he just recently turned 65, is that it's a real sticker shock for a lot of people if they're transitioning from an Affordable Care Act plan with premium subsidies, and then they turn 65 and they can't be on the ACA anymore. And then they got to go and start paying Medicare Part B premiums, and then pay for Medigap policies, and there's no subsidies anymore. For some people, it can be a real sticker shock, like 4 or 5 times more than what they were paying before they turned 65. So that's a transition for a lot of people that I didn't think about before I learned that from my brother. And then there's transitioning to Medicare. So you've got healthcare transitions before Medicare or as part of Medicare, but then you got Medicare itself. So you need to get educated on Medicare, get help. Many of you probably already make referrals to SHIP programs, or they call it SHINE in some states like Florida here. SMP for Medicare fraud is another good agency. And then you want to keep good records. And one of the things that you might want to set up is just a spreadsheet where you'll have, okay, what are the payments that were made by Medicare? What were the payments that were made by a supplemental plan? And then what were your out-of-pocket? So you basically have 3 categories. Many people don't really need to think that much about that when you only have one type of health insurance. If you've only had just your employer plan or any plan that's covering you, all of a sudden you might have a combination in later life, and you need a little bit more record keeping to keep everything straight. And then another thing to keep in mind, if you're at the higher income levels, you may want to do some adjustments in your cash flow to avoid what they call the IRMA payments. And these are for incomes this year, singles earning more than $87,000 and couples filing jointly earning more than $174,000. It's extra amounts that they have to pay for Part B and Part D premiums. You're also going to want to set new financial goals, because all the time that you're working, you're kind of doing to retirement. Retirement has been the goal. And then all of a sudden, you've been there, done that, and you still want to have what they call through retirement goals. So things like cars, travel, earning, maybe you want to do some earning and have a job still. Maybe some philanthropy goals as well. So setting new goals. And then maybe upgrading your spending, as I mentioned before, if you can afford it. Developing spending action plans. So that's what I was talking about before with like RMD money. You're going to have this money coming out. What are you going to do with it? And then maybe automating spending and gifting. So as I mentioned before, if you're having trouble spending down your savings, maybe put it on some kind of autopilot type of thing. And gifting too, like the qualified charitable distributions would be an example. That's something you could set up automatically. Simplicity, financial organization. This is the time, if you haven't done one already, to create a financial inventory. We have a form on the Rutgers Cooperative Extension website. Vanguard also has an excellent financial inventory form. What you might want to think about too is consolidating what I call like financial assets. So if you have multiple IRAs or old 401k plans from former employers or any kind of tax deferred plan, things like that. And then also maybe looking at just simplifying your financial life, things that you maybe set up automated payments for and you're not using anymore, like gyms and newspapers, satellite radio. For example, if you're commuting, like I used to have a 3-hour commute, it was nice to have satellite radio. But if you don't have a commute anymore, maybe you're not going to get the benefit from that. You might want to look at that expense. And then philanthropy usually becomes more important too. So checking out potential charities, talking to the charities, maybe you can specify a purpose that goes along with the goals of the charity. For example, 2 years ago when I was treasurer at WFCS, we had a donation that was made by a person who died, and the specified purpose was to provide funding for graduate student scholarships. And we were able to align that very nicely with the goals of the association. You might also want to do some planning of your donations and create a gifting budget. We have a form on the Rutgers website to do that. And then also taking advantage of tax advantage strategies, because most people can't itemize anymore. Only about 10% of people can itemize and get a benefit for their charitable contributions by itemizing. But there are other things that people can do, the qualified charitable distributions, donor advised funds, certain types of trusts, even bunching your donations every couple of years so you can get over the standard deduction amount, which is $24,800 for couples this year. That's a lot of standard deduction. Okay, I mentioned fraud before, and I've also already cautioned about the free meal seminars, but other things that people should just be aware of is that older people tend to get targeted because that's where the money is, and crooks know that. So some of the red flag language that you'll often hear are things like you have to act now, or you've won a certain amount of money, but you've got to pay a fee in order to get it. And of course, now we're seeing all the COVID scams with, people saying that they can get you the government money faster, or they can provide some kind of vaccine. So just a lot of fraud out there people need to be careful of, particularly the tech scams. The older adult population is #1 in frequency for reporting these to the FTC. And these are usually the type where you get these pop-ups on your screen and it locks up your browser. You just can't move. And it wants you to click on a button and just don't do it. Just power off your computer. And usually it'll get rid of the tech scams. But if you're getting that, you also need to make sure you've got all the malware put on there, malware bytes, and make sure you're using a current browser as well so that they don't pop up again. And then never signing forms with blank spaces. That's another common way that people are defrauded. And then achieving financial peace of mind. And by that, I mean just feeling comfortable with your financial status and that you're going to be okay, that you have to convince yourself, I am going to be okay. And those Monte Carlo calculators can help, financial advisors can help, spending projections, even just knowing that you're covered for the big unknown, long-term care. And I recently wrote a publication for a client about long-term care. People ask, well, what's the income level for that? It's not 100% that everybody agrees, but most people say somewhere between $250,000 to either 1.5 million or 2.5 million, depending on who you listen to, is the sweet spot for buying long-term care insurance. Because if you're on the low asset side, you'll be on Medicaid pretty quickly anyway. And if you're on the higher asset side, then obviously you've got more than enough money. And then you also want to enjoy that financial independence that you've worked so hard for. And then we transition into some of the other switches that don't necessarily have to do with finance, but are important too. So one is the what do you do question. You need to have an answer for that. And if you don't want to be identified by one of the R words, you know, whether it's retirement or rewirement or all these other words that start with re, don't let other people impose their social clocks on you. And a social clock is kind of a perception of what people should be doing at certain ages. So if any of you have talked to me in the last 18 months, you'll know that I push back pretty hard on the R word. And because I don't see myself as a retired, I see myself as a financial education entrepreneur. I'm in my new act. So that's what I do, and that's how I answer the what do I do question. There is some interesting research that indicates that people will have a much easier transition when they leave their full-time job if they can transition parts of their pre-retirement life to their post-work life. It doesn't have to be the job, though. It could be a volunteer experience. It could be a side hustle. It could be taking care of grandchildren. But if you bring something over, if you carry something over from your work life to your post-work life, people have an easier time of it because it's not total cold turkey. You're kind of having some identity carry over, which is important. So continuing those valued commitments that you have, whether it's a church committee or a professional association, and then have your new elevator speech, because it's only a matter of time somebody's going to ask you, what do you do? So my elevator speech is I'm the owner and CEO of a company called Money Talk. I write, speak, and review content on personal finance. So you need to have your own elevator speech when that time comes. You might also become the family storyteller because you might be older, and if the previous generation passes on, that goes to the next generation. And that's an important thing to do. And try to get prepared for it. Resources will help, ancestry, even birth and death certificates. There's a great tool out there. If you haven't seen it, check it out. It's called Storyworth, where maybe the adult children of an older person give a Storyworth subscription to the older adults. And it's a series of questions. And once a week, a question gets emailed to the older person so that they're reflecting on their life. And at the end of the year, a beautiful bound book is made of all the answers to the older adults' questions, and it becomes a keepsake for the family. Involve children and grandchildren. One of the best stories that I have in the book is my cousin's son did an assignment when he was in elementary school to interview my grandparents. And my grandmother wrote a letter to him because they weren't in the same community. And we have that letter as part of our family history. And we know that our great-grandparents perished in the Spanish flu. So for me, pandemics are very personal because, you know, family. I have family. I didn't know them, of course, but they were part of my family. So I take all the guidelines pretty seriously. And you can impart values with stories, you know, hard work, honesty, things of that sort. And then you want to make sure you're grooming a successor from the next generation to become the next family storyteller. There's a chapter on successful solo aging. It's estimated that 23% of older adults will be what they call solo agers, people who will be aging alone. They will not have a spouse or a child to be part of their caregiving network. So there's some suggestions there on the slide: expanding your social network, getting one of those medical alert services, maybe a continuing care community, buddying up like the Golden Girls, and then possibly leaning a little bit more on professionals who can assist in some ways. There's a chapter on finding fulfillment, and FIND is an acronym: Financial Independence, New Directions. I created that acronym because I don't think people are really just firing like financial independence, retire early. Even all those people in their 40s that have, you know, eaten dog food or cat food for 20 years to be able to retire in their 40s. I'm being facetious, but you know, they're very frugal. Many of them are blogging and doing other things. So leaving work with a plan. Don't disappear for long. I was advised by several people that if you do step back from work and you get bored and decide to go back later, don't go away for long, because if you come back after more than 2 years, you're probably going to be considered kind of rusty in your skills and maybe even irrelevant to get new jobs. So something to think about. And then cherry pick what you like. You know, there's certain parts of our jobs that we really like and certain parts that we don't like. So get rid of the things you don't like, do the things that you do. And also expect to see some ageism. And we saw that certainly with OK Boomer. Downsizing and divesting. There's a great organizer out there, Jamie Novak, who spoke for the New Jersey Association of Family Consumer Sciences a few years back. And she talks about 10-minute increments. And I followed that myself when I was downsizing both my house and my office, and it really works. Because if you think of downsizing as a big chore, you'll never get it done. But if you can just chop away, you know, 10 minutes at a time, and do 10 minutes of downsizing and then 10 minutes more if you want, or just do another 10 minutes tomorrow, you will make a big dent in what is often a big chore for a lot of people, is paring down. So setting small goals, contacting potential donees. So that's where you ask the children if they want your furniture. Probably they won't, but you know, you ask around, and possibly thrift shops and things of that sort. If you're going to be going down a room in your house, like you're going from 3 bedrooms to 2, you're going to have to get rid of a room's worth of furniture, for example. Duplicates can be a good way to start. You know, like if you have 15 tablecloths, maybe you get rid of some of the tablecloths because you still have tablecloths. And then if you're going to do yard sales, make sure you professionalize them and you have signage that's good, or tables like the $1 table and $3 table. I did 30 yard sales over 2 years, so it takes time to downsize. Speak from experience. Okay, 5 more switches really quickly. Number 21 is to get help when needed. So looking for places to get financial education resources, which of course we pride ourselves as being one of those in Cooperative Extension. I've been doing some of the webinars at UF-IFAS webinars now that I'm officially a Floridian. Libraries have programs, FBA chapters, you know, Financial Planning Association, all sorts of good places. Possibly hiring a financial advisor, and there are places you can go like the Garrett Network and the XY Planning Network for younger adults, SNAP for if you want a fee-only planner, for example. And then you want to interview planners and also any other services, because this chapter is beyond just financial planning. It's talking about maybe you need a lawn service, maybe you need some housekeeping services. So you want to interview people, and also make sure if you have people in your house, particularly unsupervised, you lock down your house, because unfortunately many instances of identity theft are through people who have access in your house. There's a chapter on should I stay or should I go? And here you want to be doing some pre-move research, thinking about the family implications of a move as far as future caregiving, and also the amount of visits that you might have and the cost of those visits. You might want to build those into your budget. Taxes, of course, come into play, and also just the necessity to really have strong relationships if you're going to be leaning on people, particularly long distance, or establishing new friendships in a new location. There's a chapter called No More Excuses. And what I mean by that is when you have a job, your job is an easy excuse. You can get out of a lot of stuff by saying, oh, sorry, I'd love to help you, but I got to work, kind of thing. Well, you don't have that excuse anymore if you've stepped away from your job. So you'll need to have a new line. Or you may want to decide to say yes, but if you've said no for 40 years because you've been too busy working, it's going to take some practice saying yes. And probably you don't want to say yes to everything or you'll be overcommitted. So you'll need a line like, well, tell me a little bit more, or I'll need a little bit more information. And then you can choose what you want to say yes to. Reaching out gingerly to people, because again, if you said no to people for 40 years, and then all of a sudden you're reaching out, just don't expect everybody to drop everything just because you have more time now. And then you need to think about opportunity costs of what you say yes to and what you say no to. This next chapter has to do, I don't know if you've ever heard the saying, but somewhere when my mom turned about her mid-70s, she started using the saying, well, people my age don't buy green bananas anymore. I don't know, has anybody ever heard your parents say that? And I was like in my 40s, and I didn't get it. I was like, Mom, you don't think you're going to live long enough for the banana to turn yellow? And I really didn't get it for a long time. And then as I got into the research for the book, I get it. You have a different time orientation when you get older. So I coined this other phrase, roll. Roll is return on life expectancy. So that's where you start making kind of mental calculations. Like if I get a dog, will I live longer than the dog, or will the dog live longer than me? So those are kind of some of the things that I talk about in this chapter, is like talking about getting a pet guardian, maybe setting aside a trust fund or some money that you give to the guardian to take care. And then there's also different groups that are out there that can help people with arrangements for pets so they don't end up in shelters or being euthanized. And then also this chapter talks about last, the last of anything that you do, and just recognizing events that could be the last time, or the last car you will buy, or the last anything. And then finally, the last chapter I'm going to talk about here is Invincible to Vulnerable. So as I was wrapping up the book, of course, COVID-19 was escalating. And for 3 weeks, I kept updating the numbers on the number of people who had died. When I turned in the manuscript, it was 9,400 people. As I checked this morning, it was over 45,000 people have died. And the big thing that was coming out then is they kept talking about the elderly. And then they kept saying anybody over 55, anybody over 60. You know, they couldn't agree who the elderly was. But all of a sudden, I was like, I was being called elderly. And I was like, excuse me, I'm not elderly. And so this whole chapter just talks about the fact that you've got to accept your vulnerability, that even if 65 is the new 45 and you believe that you're like a 45-year-old, your body is still a 65-year-old. And you need to accept that. And it becomes really important to take good care of your health, to try to stave off disease. And that's where I learned about the phrase, the Niagara Falls death. You know, like you want to have, you know, really good quality of life for as long as possible, and then go downhill and die. You don't want to have, you know, 5 years in the nursing home like that. So just taking the best care of yourself that you can, getting all the recommended screening tests that you can.